Welcome, everybody, to part of our continuing series where we talk to professors, reporters, columnists, philosophers, activists, anybody on the left, anybody on the right. We're looking for people who are thoughtful and can explain their position, and we want to provide as many different perspectives, academic and non-academic, lay public, and etc., to you, so that you can do this thing that used to be popular when I was in high school. It's not so popular these days. It's called thinking for yourself. Maybe we'll bring it back. Maybe we won't. Who knows? With us today is Dr. Stephen Mcmullen. He is the Associate Professor of Economics at Hope College. He's the Executive Editor of the Journal of Faith and Economics, host of the podcast Faithful Economy, Fellow at the Oxford Center for Animal Ethics, and Senior Fellow at Sentient Media. He began teaching economics at Hope in 2014. He teaches microeconomic and macroeconomic theory courses and the history of economic thought. During May term, he regularly takes a class to London. One of Stephen's academic positions is to explore Christian thinking about economics. He serves as the executive editor of the Journal of Faith and Economics and host of the podcast Faithful Economy, both associated with the Association of Christian Economists. He contributes regularly to the blog of the Christian Scholars Review. Stephen also engages in the empirical education policy research. His published work includes studies of year-round schooling, school crowding, and homework. He is currently pursuing work on private school enrollment trends. His recent co-authored book studies the use of technology in primary and secondary schools. Much of his recent academic work lies at the intersection of moral philosophy and economics. He is the author of a book on animal ethics and economics and has published articles on environmental ethics, animal ethics, and technology. And he's a fellow at the Oxford Center for Animal Ethics and a consultant editor of the Journal of Animal Ethics. His current book project is a debate about the redistribution and the welfare state. And this is the article we wanted to talk about today, why we are polarized. But first, Professor, did I get anything wrong? Do we need to correct something, go over something?
That's all right. It's only a few months out of date at this point. My most recent book, called "Should We Redistribute Wealth? A Debate," that has come out. That came out earlier this year, and I am no longer a senior fellow at Sentient Media, but that was true when it was written. So I need to go update that online. But yeah, that's basically right. I teach economics at Hope College, and I do work on animal ethics and political philosophy and education policy. So
let's get into the meat and potatoes.
Sounds good.
As they say here in the Central Valley. This article came out on April 28, 2021. I'd like to ask you a question, but before you answer, if you could please answer as both an academic and as an American who's not an academic but has two eyeballs that are working.
Yeah.
What was going on in 2020 around this time? Why did you care about looking at a book on polarization, writing an article on polarization? Was it an important topic at that time? What's going on? Why did you bother to even look in this or do a book review?
That's a good question. Of course, the last few years politically in the United States has been unique. Certainly in my lifetime. The degree of political animosity in our country definitely picked up. I think uniquely in 2020 and 2021, and maybe just since Donald Trump entered the scene in 2015, 2016, there was probably an uptick there, but politics became harder. It became more fraught. People, I think, have become more angry, but I'd say that was even more the case in 2020 and 2021 when I was writing this and thinking about these things and doing this reading than it is today. But I wouldn't say that we're in a great spot now. But that was the context. So I'm, like most other folks in the country, probably were watching the way politics were going in around us, with our friends, with our colleagues, in our state politics, international politics, and I just became very worried. And I wanted to understand what was going on, and so I did what an academic does. I started reading books, and I started writing, and I started talking about it with people, whoever I could, and that's the story. That's the backstory.
You're saying that political polarization has calmed down
Um,
from
I don't
between
think
2021 and now?
probably not by any measurable quantity. Certainly not the way Congress is. So we can measure polarization in a bunch of different ways. I don't think I've seen it calm down in any tangible place in the numbers. I think if anything, what I've seen is that today it might be the case that people are slightly less sort of existentially angry about politics than they were a year or two ago.
Okay.
But I don't. But I don't know. But 2020 and 2021 were wild years between the protests about racial justice across the country and the COVID restrictions and all of the anger about shutting down schools and vaccines. I think that might have been a uniquely angry and polarized moment, at least within my lifetime.
Fair enough, but we also saw a period of polarization with the introduction of Trump, right, in 2016,
Yes.
and that had nothing to do with COVID or the exacerbating tensions. People just got that riled up without being told that you had to stay home for a year. So we've seen that a couple times. I want to ask you, I really appreciate you talking about how you'd noticed that it is unique in the last few years, certainly in your lifetime. Was there any political polarization in America before Donald Trump? Or did we live in a perfect state of utopia, and then he came and he's the one that broke all the king's horses and men? And if we could just get rid of him, everything will snap back together. Is that? Do you agree with that theory?
No, certainly not. And I mean, if you look back in history, in the U.S. history, it might even be that certainly the period before Trump, I think, we could say would be less polarized than post-Trump. But the middle part of the 20th century was probably, if you take Ezra Klein's account seriously, and I do, and we can talk about that book, but he makes the case that the middle part of the 20th century was a period in which we had less polarization than we did before or after, and that might have been a bit of an anomaly. So early in U.S. history, things were quite polarized. Certainly, the period around the U.S. Civil War was violently polarized over the issue of course, of slavery and the surrounding politics and conflict. So in the middle part of the 20th century, less polarized. End of the 20th century, we see an increase in polarization that I think it's fair to say got uniquely bad in 2015, 2016.
So what are you talking about?
2020. Sorry?
Are we talking about 1950s, 1960s when you say mid-20th century?
Yeah. So I'd have to go back. I don't have the data in front of me, but my sense is that in terms of 1950s to 1980s, I think was a period. I mean, I can give you a sense of what I mean by that. If you look at the number of Congress people that are willing to work across the aisle with one another, co-sponsored bills, right? Congress was less polarized in the middle part of the 20th century. But also, if you look at metrics like how much animosity Republicans feel toward Democrats in polling and this kind of thing, it was better in the middle part of the 20th century than the end. Yeah.
Sure. Which means that we're going back to a level of polarization we haven't seen in 70 to 80 years. Is that correct?
Easily. Maybe longer.
That's a big jump. That's kind of a big jump, right? I mean, even if we're saying, hey, there were periods of higher polarization and then less polarization and higher polarization, okay, that gives you hope for the future, that maybe we could have a less polarized future. But we also have to take that within context. The fact is that we're dealing, therefore, now with levels of polarization not seen in 70 to 80 years. So it is significant and different. Some people have said polarization goes back to Barack Obama as president and the Tea Party. Some people have said it goes back to Newt Gingrich in 1992 when he took over the Republican Party, and he said, we are no longer hanging out with each other after office hours. So you used to have a thing where they debate on TV during the day, and then all their wives knew each other, and you'd have dinner and drinks and, schmooze in cigar-filled rooms. And, that's excessive, but they would spend time with each other. And that ended in 1992 with Gingrich. Are there earlier points before Trump that you could point to, and I guess after the 1980s, that you could go, yeah, that I understand it's hard to say. I don't have exact data, but just as an American with eyeballs going like, yeah, things seem to get worse after that happened. I remember that. Is there anything you could point to and go, I remember noticing a difference in how we got along after that event or after that period or roughly at this time, anything before the era of Trump.
I think you point out a couple of important points. I have to confess, my personal memories don't go further back than George H.W. Bush. Just when I'm not
Hey,
that old,
fair.
but my sense is that from looking at the political trajectory over the last 50 years, we've seen is kind of a slow ratcheting or increase since the 1980s for sure, of increased polarization in Congress in particular. And I think people are right to point to the Contract with America and Newt Gingrich. I think I'm associating those correctly.
Yes,
Um,
yes, sir.
I think the debates in Congress about judges. I think there's sort of a clear sort of ratcheting up of tactics and rhetoric, and judges, Supreme Court judges, but federal judges in general. That becomes a kind of existential point that continually kind of gets worse every 5 to 10 years. And then, I mean, it's kind of fair to point to every 5 or 10 years things being worse. I don't want to blame Newt Gingrich or Barack Obama uniquely because the trend is longer than either of them. Trump might be unique in his ability to spur animosity, but even then, we have to note that this is a trend, certainly in Congress. I've heard people talk about the polarization of news media as an important thing, and so then you might point to the advent of cable news. Others would point to Twitter becoming a major place for political conversation. But all of these things are happening kind of over the same time period, and the problem is just that the polarization only seems to be moving in one direction.
I want to get to the causes of polarization. You named a couple of them, but before we do that, I wanted to ask you a question. You said that polarization seems to be, certainly at Congress.
Yeah.
Are the people themselves polarized? I've seen a lot of debates with professors where they're going, no, 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 no. It's just the elites are polarized. And if the people acted out, it's only because the elites give them signals. And once the elites go away or stop giving signals, all the people will come back together and they'll stop being polarized automatically. I've also heard from other people, that's ridiculous. Are you kidding? People stormed the Capitol for the first time since 1812. We are taught that's, yes, Donald Trump got them riled up, but they had to be a certain level of polarized to even contemplate something like that. And Trump never would have won in 2016 if the country wasn't already ready for a super polarized message. And yeah, COVID made things worse, but we have polls showing that 80% of Biden voters and 80% of Trump voters, yes, it was during COVID, but they said they viewed all other voters as, quote, a clear and present danger. The phrase used for a Russian nuclear strike or an ISIS terrorist attack. This was by the University of Virginia Center for Politics, a reputable center. And people go, oh, well, that was COVID. Okay. 80% though. I mean, I get you're upset, but damn, 4/5 of both parties saying I view you like ISIS. Oh, it's just all COVID. Really? And then my last statistic is this one. They go, in 2012, 1/3 of voters said, I don't want someone I know dating outside of my party.
Yeah.
It's now over half. It's the majority of voters in America don't want anyone they know dating outside the party. That started before COVID and continues after COVID. So, in your opinion, is it just the elites, or can we say the people themselves are polarized at least to some extent too?
I think you're right in pointing to some really good data there that it is across the population. Now, one of the ways of thinking about this is to ask, like, are the polarization of the elites sort of just bringing the people along with them, or is it the other way around? And honestly, I don't know if there's an easy way to definitively answer that question. But at minimum, we can say with a high degree of confidence that the polarization is a population-wide phenomenon, right? And the things that you point to there, particularly, I think the unwillingness to date or to marry people of another political party or be in a relationship with them, I think that's really, I think that's powerful data because it points to the degree to which people are viewing folks on the other team as the enemy, right? As folks that are not part of polite society. This isn't just a disagreement about sports teams, and it's not just a disagreement about policy anymore. I've seen other data just recently that that people are more likely than they were in the past to contemplate abandoning democratic process because they're so afraid about the other party. And this is true in both parties. I'd have to go look up exactly the wording of those questions. I should have had that pulled up. But then also that people are on both sides of the party are more likely today than 20 years ago to say that they think it would be justified to fire someone at their firm, or that they wouldn't want to work with someone or hire someone at their place of work if the person was a Republican or a Democrat, if they were on the other side. And so we see the political divisions showing up in the workplace.
I gotta find that. I gotta find that study. If you see it, please
yeah,
send it.
I know I can send you links. Yeah, because I just cited that one. Oh, wait, let's see. I just cited the workplace one, so I can pull that one for you as soon as we're done talking.
Sorry.
No, that's fine. And but I mean, I just think this shows that it's going pretty deep, right? Because we're seeing it across institutions and across settings. It's not just in politics. It's in the workplace. It's in the family. Now, it might still be led by the elites. I think that's a reasonable hypothesis. I don't know, but at minimum, it is everywhere, right? One more thing I would note. I think the best argument you could make is that there might be a big chunk of the country that is not polarized, that because of the polarization is relatively quiet. You could make the argument that the polarization is being driven by the edges of the political distribution, and those edges might be disproportionately represented in the elites. But it's still a pretty big part of the population. I've seen some data about the distribution of political views that makes me think that might be the case. But yeah, okay, I've gone on long enough.
I also heard a study by Professor Samara Klar out of University of Arizona. I'm still trying to find it, but there was some sort of survey that showed that conservatives and liberals in America have the same amount of animosity to each other as Israelis and Palestinians. I'm still trying to find that study. I found, yeah, right, kind of shocking, trying to find that study, but I've heard one or two professors say that there's a professor called Samara Klar and she has that data. So I want to find that. The question is, I guess the question is, okay, let's say the elites are encouraging this behavior. Certainly Donald Trump dog whistled and kind of encouraged people to storm the Capitol. I get it. I still find it a little bit difficult to believe that somebody can just go out there and go, let's storm the Capitol. And everybody goes, oh, you know what? I was going to go get an ice cream today, but I'll go do that instead. I feel like you got to be primed. You got to be angry. You got to be amped up. You got to be ready for that message. I have met people who went to January 6th. They never went in the Capitol. They never intended to go to the Capitol. They wanted to go and listen to a speech, and that's all they were interested into. And that's probably why they never entered the Capitol, because they weren't amped up for that. And they didn't think Donald Trump was a god. They thought he was wronged, but they didn't believe he was a savior like some of the hardcore MAGA. So I met a few of these people, and I noticed a differentiation of a range of scale. Some MAGA people, from what I've seen, absolutely do believe he is the second coming, from what I've seen. And that's true, but not all of them. My question is, okay, let's go to Russia. You had Russia for a long time was a czarist, very traditional culture. And then they invented this thing called communism. And they wanted to change the culture. Well, they did. Lenin took over and they switched to communism, and then Stalin took over after him. After Stalin died and Lenin died, they didn't go back to being traditional Russian culture. They stayed this new Soviet culture that they learned, and that continued on for another 80 years. Even if the super polarizing leaders in America die off, do we know that people stop believing in their ideology? Or is it continued like many ideologies we've seen around the globe in the last 10,000 years of human history?
It does have kind of a self-fulfilling quality to it, in part because we choose our leaders on the basis of their purity in pursuit of a movement, particularly in the kind of environment that we have today, the kind of media environment we have today, in which people are doing fundraising primarily by getting the attention of the folks that are most activated politically, which are the folks that are angry. And that just means that even if we were to replace all of our political leaders, the process through which we're choosing them is a highly polarized and charged process. So we'd probably just recreate the general dynamics. It's in the culture. It's in the culture, and it's in the institutions at this point. And so I think even without Donald Trump, if he went away today and left the American politics, that might have a kind of a calming effect, particularly on the Republican Party. Well, no, probably on both parties. But it wouldn't bring us back to 1950s levels of consensus.
I'm just wondering, because I'm in the Central Valley and we have a lot of veterans.
Yeah.
And sometimes people go off to war and they never come back. And it doesn't matter how much psychological counseling they get and how much hugs and love from their family, they're permanently changed because of that experience, and there is no return. They are that new person for the rest of their life. Saw that with Vietnam, saw that with Iraq. And I'm just wondering if there's a certain level of trauma that can happen to people at the 100 to 200 million people scale that would cause the same thing. We are living through traumatic times. Talked to a lot of people who said January 6th was traumatic. The way they talk about it is the way somebody talks about having PTSD. It shocked the hell out of people. Also, what shocked the hell out of people was that the Republican Party initially agreed that it was a coup and was wrong, and then backed away from that. Yeah. And was able to hold on to that. So I hear Trump has all these cases against him and that he's guilty. Great. But didn't we do 2 or 3 impeachments? And every single time you said, this is it, we got him, everybody's going to repudiate him. That was years ago. And they're still talking about him. Is it unreasonable for someone to have trouble having faith that you're actually going to get rid of this guy's imprint on American politics, given everything you've done and how it totally failed over a 4 to 6 year period?
Well, I'm not even going to pretend to try to predict what the next 5 years hold or what Trump's future holds. I got nothing.
Fair enough.
But yeah, I think it'd be fair to be very uncertain at this point.
Let's go to the article.
Okay.
I have a few more questions, but let's go to the article. Why we're polarized. Political scientists have long studied polarization in Congress and the electorate, but over the last decade, it seems people have really begun to feel it. We are a culture and country that is deeply divided, and we are more dramatically divided than we were 20 or 30 years ago. Earlier this year, before the pandemic and the George Floyd protest, Vox co-founder and podcaster Ezra Klein published a book simply titled Why We're Polarized. While Klein is not a political scientist, he is a long participant and student of American politics, true, and he takes his reader through an immersive tour of the best evidence from psychology, political science, and history. His story has no heroes or villains, and yet he provides a comprehensive and deep explanation for why our country feels so polarized. In case you're not someone who reads books about politics, let me give you my recommendation to start. I think it's the most important book you can read to understand contemporary American politics. The big interesting takeaway from the book, though, is that our cultural identities have become political in a way that they might not have been previously. Klein says that we have developed political mega identities. For example, it used to be the case that both the Republican and Democratic parties were largely Christian, both had rural and urban representation, and both contained business, worker, and agricultural interests. Today, the parties have very different constituencies. The Republican Party is largely the party of white Christians, while the Democratic Party has a large majority of Black and Hispanic Americans and those who are not religious, etc. I think we can see the way that goes. Tell us more about this article. What was Ezra Klein's point? What did you take away from it? Why is America polarized to Ezra Klein, and do you agree with his reasoning?
So the last part's easy. I think Ezra did as good a job of describing the political dynamics over the 20th century, over the last 70 years at least, as I've seen. And I still recommend the book very highly. I don't think it's now getting a couple of years old, but I don't think it's dated. Klein makes a number of different arguments, but I think a couple of the big ones have to do with politics of race in the 20th century in the U.S. that the middle part of the 20th century, he argues, was less polarized, in part because up until the conflict of the civil rights movement, but also even for a fair bit after that, we basically had a political system that agreed not to argue about race in the United States, and it also was a period in which arguments about immigration were a little bit less charged, in part because they weren't easily divided between the parties, and so they weren't activated by political competition. But this means that when we get to the end of the 20th century, in part we're polarized more today than we were 50 years ago, because the political landscape just shifts. So that debates about race and debates about immigration all of a sudden become partisan in a way that they weren't before. And then all of a sudden, the dividing lines become very clear across in American political culture. Now, we could go deeper into that kind of history. I think that's all really interesting. But the piece that I really found compelling was that and this is what the bit that you highlighted here, was that Klein makes the argument that different parts of our identity are politicized, or at least sorted today, when they weren't before. So I happen to be a mainline Christian. So I'm a Christian in one of the old denominations, old Protestant denominations in the United States. And it would have been 50 to 60 years ago the case that telling you that would not have given you any information about my politics.
Right.
Now, today, the fact that I just told you that I went to church, it doesn't even matter what church I go to. That actually does, it doesn't actually tell you anything about my politics, but on average, it tells you that I'm more likely to be a conservative than a liberal. So that Christianity has become more polarized than it was before. But then we can do this with other things. Certainly, this is true with occupations. If I know that you're a school teacher at a public school, I know more about your politics today than I did 50 years ago. Right. And you can just go down the list now. If I know that you really like to buy Starbucks coffee, I know more about your politics today than I would have 50 years ago. And I could go on.
I heard this expressed as, we used to have overlapping identities. So you had some conservative Democrats, you had some liberal Republicans, you'd have Democrats had their kids in Boy Scouts, Republicans had their kids in Boy Scouts. And there was differences between the parties, but the parties were like this. And now we've done this. Where there used to be overlap. Okay, we got our hardcore Republican fringe and our hardcore liberal fringe, but they're kind of connected to this overall party that is somewhat connected to the other party. So you can't polarize too much. I mean, this guy can go, oh, I hate those Dems, but the Dems are going, yeah, but we share with half of your Republicans. Now we've done two separate parties. If you are white, male, Christian, blue collar, you watch Fox News and like Donald Trump, I don't even need to ask you questions. I can just assume that about you. If you are a minority, non-Christian, and live in the city, I know you're liberal and love AOC, and I can just assume that and not even ask any questions about you. And that's how we've turned into that. Let me ask you a question related to that. Some people have said polarization was worse in the 1960s. And they go, hey, Mark, don't worry. I know it's polarized now, but it was polarized in the 60s and it was worse. It was way more violent in the 60s. People were getting shot, Kent State Massacre, judges and lawyers executed. But I've also heard some people say, true, but it's worse now than the 1960s for this reason. And I think you're pointing at this. They had common belief in common institutions in the 1960s, and we have no such thing now. So they believed in the right of Congress to pass laws, the right of the Supreme Court to interpret laws, that an election happened and that guy, even if you didn't like him, was president. Now we have the lowest faith in all branches of the federal government except for the military. We have people openly defying the Supreme Court, and we have both parties have now gone through the process of saying, I'm just going to act like the guy you say won what didn't win for the last 4 years. And you had nothing like that in the 1960s. Thoughts, feelings?
A couple of things, because I think that this gets at something that's important. One bit is that in the 1960s, there were huge cultural divisions, and like we still talk about these cultural divisions, right? Around anti-war protests, certainly around youth culture, and the emergence of rock and roll and other kinds of things in that area. It was very tumultuous, and it was accompanied by a lot of violence. And I think that we've lived a long time without that level of political violence, and I think it was pretty scary at the time. But there were a couple of things that were different in the 1960s. While the culture was really, really divided, and there were legitimately fighting about some really important things, at the same time, it wasn't as mirrored in our politics as it is today. So that if you look at politics in the 1960s and movement, the political divisions between the parties, there's really serious divides in the 1960s in politics, right? With the civil rights movement between the North and the South and whatnot, and the Democratic Party and Republican Party get fundamentally reshaped over the 20 years that follow. But our politics wasn't as polarized. The political process was not as polarized at the time as it has been since 2000. The other thing I would note is one piece of Ezra Klein's analysis that I think is important to note is that if you accept his argument about these shifting and sorting identities and polarized identities, the implication is that for most people, I shouldn't say for most people, but for a large number of people, they might not have any friends or family that they associate regularly with that are on the other side of the political aisle.
Yeah.
They might not work with anyone on the other side of the political aisle. Their neighbors may or may not be on the other side of the political aisle, but probably most of their neighbors agree with them. So we're now living in a world in which we're fighting with the same level of animosity in some sense, although thankfully not necessarily the same level of violence as the 1960s. But we don't have relationships that cross the aisle that can temper the animosity and the fighting in quite the same way. Now, plenty of us know folks on both sides of the aisle, but it's just it's becoming less common. We're becoming more sorted, I should say, around both in our occupations, geography, in terms of demographics. And that just changes the quality and the nature of the polarization.
Let me ask you a quick question, just off the top of your head.
Yeah.
Would you say that a Republican who has lived the last 20 years in downtown San Francisco, California, has the same opinion on issues as a Republican who spent his whole life, and is an old man now, in rural Kentucky?
I mean, that's a very different life trajectories.
They see things the same. They got the same opinion on guns and abortion and women straight down the middle, right?
There's probably there's probably some differences. Like you can probably find me somebody in San Francisco that agrees with somebody in rural Kentucky. I bet those people exist. But in general, if you're a Republican in California or a Democrat in Kansas, and if you're surrounded by folks who are regularly interacting with people on the other side of the aisle, that can be polarizing if it just results in a lot of conflict for you. But often it means at least that you understand the other side better. It's harder, I think, to caricature the folks on the other side of the aisle if you actually know them. That's just my guess, though. I actually don't have data for this one. I don't know what the views of Republicans in San Francisco are like, but my guess is that on average they're more moderate than Republicans in Kentucky.
So there's a theory called the Big Sort. And it says that roughly since 1992, maybe earlier, there's some debate, Americans have been sorting themselves into ideological similar communities. They've been doing this across America. So, someone is a Republican in San Francisco. I'm tired of being called out, and I don't really like, this doesn't fit my lifestyle. So they move to Kentucky. And that leaves San Francisco now even more blue because you got rid of conservatives. Take the other thing, rural Kansas, liberals leave. That makes it even more red. There is some debate on if people are saying consciously, I want to go somewhere where everybody votes like me, or if they're looking for more like lifestyle and social cues and cultural things. And then when they move to a culture or area that feels more comfortable, they begin to start voting like people in the neighborhood. There's a lot of evidence suggesting people vote like people in their neighborhood, even though they may not have explicit conversations about politics. They seem to do that. So we've been getting this sorting, and 538 has backed this up. New York Times, Wall Street Journal, NPR did a 3-part series over 15 years showing how this is still accurate from 2008 to 2022. But this is the map I wanted to show you. This comes from the New York Times, and it came out in 2016. The book, The Big Sort, came out in the late 90s, early 2000s. This comes out almost 20 years later and completely backs up all the conclusions of the book. And what we're going to look at is counties that voted for the Republican or Democratic presidential candidate by 20 percentage points or more, called landslide election counties. This was a big theme in this book, The Big Sort. Yeah. So landslide election county basically means one party wins here by 20 percentage points over the other party. So you really have no, it's like when Ron DeSantis won in Florida. Like there was no chance, not even in your wildest dreams, for anybody else. Like it was going to be him no matter what. I'm not endorsing DeSantis. I'm giving an example of a landslide election. That's all I'm doing. Okay. Please don't give me phone calls after this. Okay, liberals, because I'm a liberal and I'm going to get phone calls if I don't. So the looking at this, if you look at the map in the top left, very top left, I know it's hard to see, but those are counties. So it's a fine grained map. Those are counties and the electoral vote. That's 2016 top map. And then directly below it, the big map is 2016. So you can go 2000 and I forget, 1992 top left. Directly behind the top left, directly below it is the 2004 map. Directly below that is the 2016 map. And what you can see is red means don't even run here if you're not a Republican. You have no chance of winning. Blue means don't even run here if you're not a Democrat. You have no chance of winning. But gray means competitive. Sometimes they vote for McCain. Sometimes they vote for Obama, depending on the message and where they think the country is at that moment. And you can see how all the gray's almost been wiped out. It almost completely sorted into hardcore red, hardcore blue. There almost is no counties where we're open to either message. I'm living in one of the few remaining ones here in the Central Valley where Republicans and Democrats win by like 51%. So yeah, they beat you, but it's just barely, it's teetering. Most of the country isn't like that. It's not competitive. It's basically don't even run here. Like we're never going to listen to you. This seems to show a big sort. My follow-up question is this. If you look at the top row, map on the top left is 1992. You go immediately to the right, that's 1996. And this is the top row. And you go to the far right, and that's the year 2000. So here's the question. Let me pull up the cue prompt I had for this. Here we go. Political polarization, gerrymandering didn't really get started till 2010. Some political scientists say, yeah, it came out in 2000, wasn't really a factor till 2010. Social media wasn't really polarizing us until maybe 2015. You can push it down to 2010 if you want. Extreme politicians really only popped up the last 2 years of Trump's term, somewhere around 2017 to 2019. And entertainmentization or extreme polarizing news cycles, at least for many, got big during the Obama era. And all of those things came after the big sort. Yeah. So the big sort starts up in 1992 or earlier. Now, the question is this. When Marjorie Taylor Greene, and I'm not endorsing her, said, hey, we need to have a national divorce because red and blue can't live together, they said, well, you know, that's crazy and we don't need to do that. But this shows there is sorting. And one of the things that reporters said, 30 different articles, was, okay, maybe there's polarization, but it's gerrymandering and it's social media and it's extreme politicians. The big sort predates all those things by 15 to 20 years. And we're looking at polarization between 1992 and 2000, the first row, where we go from majority of the country's gray to half the country's gray is wiped out. By the year 2000, that's before gerrymandering, social media, extreme politicians, or the media getting involved heavily like during the Tea Party and Obama. Why were 30 newspaper articles in mainstream news publications across America only able to mention everything but the big sort as a cause for polarization when the big sort predates all these things by 20 years?
That's a lot of question there. Let me just note a couple of things. All right. So first off, what I can't see from this data, and maybe you have this, what you're seeing here is counties.
Yeah.
I don't know from looking at these maps, because I haven't looked at this, what percentages of the population were in heavily sorted counties or in districts in each of these years, because that might be relevant. If you have, it could be the case that in 2000 or 2004, you have a lot of counties that are well sorted, but like a lot of the population is still in pretty evenly matched places. I'm not sure if that would change the timeline significantly, but it's worth looking at. Maps can be deceiving that way just because of the distribution of the population.
Fair enough. Fair enough.
But honestly, I think there's lots and lots of causes to point to here, and clearly the sorting or the movement of people has been part of this, and it contributes to and it creates the situation in which all of these other things can have power as well. But it's also probably reinforced by these other things we're pointing to. And I don't have a great way of figuring out which of these at the moment, certainly with the data that we have. I can't tell you which of these is the most powerful causes and which ones are not. Certainly, the movement of people is contributing. And I'd go so far as to say I've been looking at gerrymandering stuff for a while because it's been a big issue in my home state here in Michigan, and the movement and the sorting of population around the state, even within a state, is a significant cause, or it makes it really actually quite difficult to draw maps that are really competitive. So even if we were able to get rid of gerrymandering, as we have in our state to a pretty significant degree with an independent commission, you still have a lot of districts that are not that competitive because of this phenomenon.
You saw political sorting in Michigan?
Yeah, so we have in Michigan we have a lot. We've much like much of the rest of the country. We have a few sort of population centers that are very blue and a lot of rural areas that are very red. I'm living on the west side of the state, so it's a relatively conservative area. We're pretty far from the population centers of Lansing, Detroit, and we're about a half hour from Grand Rapids. But you see the same pattern here as you see around the country.
Wow.
But even though the state is actually still very evenly divided, so
Sure.
the state is totally up for grabs at the national level, but quite sorted at the county level.
Yeah. You've seen this, so you've seen it. Okay, Michigan. And Michigan was one of the areas that was one of the strong holdouts. It used to be very competitive for a very long time. It was one of the last states to flip. Okay.
I'm just going to say, for Michigan's sake, it is still going to be competitive. The Democrats have control right now, and I honestly don't know if that's going to hold in 2 years, in 4 years, in 6 years. So it's still going to be an interesting place to watch. Everyone should still send the reporters here because Michigan's a great place for politics. Okay. Anyway,
it's getting sorted, but still send the reporters. Don't assume that you know which way Michigan's going.
That's right.
To vote. Okay. One of the last questions I wanted to ask you, and this just kind of, because I've heard a lot of people talking about how do we fix polarization. And they're saying, well, and I think you hinted at this a little bit, you got to have a meaningful interaction with someone from the other side. But my question is this: I'm a hardcore liberal in San Francisco, and I go to Starbucks, and I run into a guy who says he's a Republican. And he says, you know what? I'm more interested in taxes. I'm not really concerned about LGBTQ. Do whatever you want. I don't care. Can we assume he'd have the same conversation as if we took that California liberal and transplanted him to Joe's barbecue house in rural Kentucky, and he had a conversation with a Republican there? Is it likely that when he talks to that Republican in rural Kentucky, old, never been to the big cities, no interaction with minorities or LGBTQ people, is also going to say, I don't really care about that issue? Or will he maybe have a different opinion than the Republican who has to live in San Francisco and is exposed to LGBTQ people every day?
I mean, I don't honestly know how much benefit would come from conversations among people who are very polarized. I do think there's probably a lot of excuse me. I think there's probably a lot of benefit from folks kind of in the middle, 50 to 60%, folks on the left and folks on the right being in relationship with one another, if only because it does make it more difficult to accept a sort of a cheap caricature of the preferences of the folks on the other side. If you're actually having, in relationship, in conversation with these people because they're your friends, neighbors, and family. That feels to me like an important sort of buffer is to have sort of longstanding relationships, so that when someone tells me Republicans are crazy or Democrats are crazy, I can say, well, I understand your argument, but the folks that I'm talking to don't seem crazy, right? We disagree, but they're not crazy. And I can always go talk to them and say, hey, what's your view on this? And realize, okay, there's, they love their children and they want a, strong education system, and they want, safe communities, and we're all looking for some of the same things on those. My sense is that those kinds of relationships are a really important bulwark against a political division. I don't know how to manufacture those, and I don't know how to wind back to a period of more political peace, but I think that's a part of it.
I hope that you found that this was a fair interview. I didn't put words in your mouth. We didn't do gotcha journalism. Maybe had an okay time. Is there anyone who might be willing to be part of having an honest conversation about this? You don't have to know anybody, but we always like to ask. They could be on the left, they could be on the right, they could be an activist, they could be an academic. Doesn't matter, just somebody who's thoughtful and you think may be willing to be part of this kind of awkward but honest conversation.
Well, first off, I haven't found this conversation awkward at all. It's been a lot of fun, and I thank you a lot for initiating it. And I hope our discussing these things is helpful to someone. Nobody comes to mind immediately that I'm gonna give you their names in the moment, but let me think on it, and maybe I can send you some names. I'll see if there's. I'll have to sort of sit back and think a little bit about who I might know that would have something real to offer on this.
Awesome. Yeah. Okay. Last question. We always ask everybody. You're not you. You're not me. You're a third-party person who's watching this video. You've never met them. You can't even imagine how they are, who they think, how they are, what they think, what their basic philosophies are. They watched this interview. They thought it was great. It's a week from now. They're struggling to remember the interview. They thought, well, I saw some interesting things. There's a lot of good stuff in there. I can't remember it all, but there was this one thing that the professor said at the end, and it's 5 days later, and I can't get my head to stop thinking about it every day. What is that one thing you want this person you've never met, you'll never meet, to not be able to get out of their head 5 days from now after watching this interview?
I don't know if I'm going to be able to stick in anybody's memory. As a professor,
give it a shot.
I try to do that. All right. Well, here. I think the big takeaway is this, and we've been dancing around this, but I think the big takeaway is that we need to build spaces, and we need to protect the spaces in which we have productive relationships with people who disagree with us, where conversations can happen. That is, we need political spaces that are not polarized, spaces that are profiting from division. And those could be community centers, they could be schools, they could be churches, they could be firms, right? There's lots of places where we find community. And so the more spaces that we can protect that aren't polarized, I think the more we're moving in the right direction. That's what's animating me in this.
Okay, we'll leave it there. Thank you so much for coming out. I will send you a copy of this interview in a little bit on email. Really appreciate you willing to take all the questions without any reservation and thinking to a theoretical capacity. Not everybody's willing to do that, but we find it very helpful for the viewers. And thank you for coming out. Thank you for being here. Thank you for answering questions. And we really appreciate your time.
Hey, no problem. It was a lot of fun.
All right. I'll email you very soon.
All right. Sounds good.